On the night of October 19, 1973, Keita Haig and her husband Richard were taking a peaceful evening walk near Chestnut Street in San Francisco when a van pulled up alongside the curb. Within seconds, two men jumped out, forced the couple into the back at gunpoint, and drove them to an isolated industrial area near the bay. There was no demand for money, no prior connection, and no room for mercy. The attackers dragged Keita into the darkness and executed her with horrific violence, nearly decapitating her with a blade. They turned on Richard next, beating him, slashing his face and neck, and leaving him for dead in the brush alongside his wife's lifeless body. Miraculously, Richard Haig survived. When he finally pulled himself from the shadows, staggeringly disoriented and drenched in his own blood, he managed to stumble toward the faint glow of streetlights on Army Street. A passing motorist caught sight of a man with severe lacerations across his face and neck, staggering through the dark, and immediately summoned help. When emergency crews arrived, Richard could barely speak through his injuries, but he managed to whisper a description of his attackers and the terrifying reality that his wife had been dragged deeper into the desolate rail yard. When police searched the darkness nearby, they discovered the body of 28-year-old Keita Haig. She had been brutally murdered, nearly decapitated with a machete. The sheer barbarity of the crime stunned veteran homicide investigators. Must start exactly completing the sentence from the prompt. Check length, aiming for 1,300, 1,500 words. Let's make sure the detail is dense, precise, and atmospheric. Writing the script iterative check during drafting. Seamless start. No apparent motive, leaving homicide detectives grasping at ghosts while the body count continued to climb across San Francisco. By April of 1974, 76 separate police teams were assigned to the case, yet the killers operated with a terrifying, unpredictable rhythm. They struck in broad daylight, in crowded residential neighborhoods, and on busy commercial corridors. The victims shared no common background, no common vulnerability, age, or routine, united only by their skin color and the sudden, unprovoked nature of the violence. By late April, San Francisco had transformed into a city paralyzed by fear. Evening streets emptied early, public transit ridership plummeted, and a pervasive paranoia gripped every neighborhood. Desperate for a breakthrough, Mayor Joseph Alioto and Police Chief Donald Scott took an unprecedented and deeply divisive step. They authorized Operation Zebra. Under this citywide mandate, police officers were instructed to stop, question, and frisk any young black man who remotely matched the extraordinarily broad description of the suspect, a black male between 5'9" and 6 feet tall, of medium build. In a matter of days, police conducted over 600 stops on the streets of San Francisco. The strategy was immediate, sweeping, and deeply destructive to community trust. Citizens who had no connection to any crime were pulled from public buses, stopped while walking home from work, and forced against police cruisers at gunpoint. The legal and social backlash was swift. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the ACLU, filed immediate federal lawsuits against the city, arguing that Operation Zebra constituted unconstitutional racial profiling on a mass scale. Federal District Judge Alfonso Zerpali agreed, issuing an injunction that halted the random stops and admonished city leaders for violating the constitutional rights of an entire demographic. The dragnet had failed. It had produced 0 leads, alienated the very communities police needed assistance from, and left the department back at square one while the killers remained at large. But what the public did not know at the time was that, while the mayor and police chief were defending their dragnet in federal court, a quiet rupture was already forming inside the conspirators' own inner circle. The breakthrough did not come from aggressive street tactics or brilliant forensic detective work. It came from a man who walked into the police station looking for a way out. His name was Anthony Harris. In late April 1974, as the city reeled under the terror of the Zebra attacks, Harris made contact with law enforcement. He was not a bystander. He was an insider who had worked alongside the men responsible for the violence. Terrified that his co-conspirators suspected him of disloyalty, and lured by the city's unprecedented $100,000 reward for information, Harris offered to reveal everything. But when detectives sat down with Harris in a secure, undisclosed location, the story he began to outline was far more complex and organized than a series of opportunistic thrill kills. Harris revealed that the shootings were not the work of isolated, random actors, but the execution of a methodical campaign driven by an extremist splinter faction operating within the Nation of Islam. This underground cell called themselves the Death Angels. According to Harris, members earned prestige, advancement, and literal wings, represented by violent credits recorded within their private ranks, by committing cold-blooded murders of white citizens. Detectives were initially skeptical. The claim sounded like an impossible conspiracy theory, the kind of outlandish narrative an informant might spin to secure immunity and cash. But then Harris began supplying specific, unreleased details that only someone present at the crime scenes could possibly know. He described the internal operations of the Black Self-Help Moving Company, a business located on Market Street that served as the operational headquarters for the group. He named names: J.C. Simon, Larry Green, Manuel Moore, and Jesse Lee Cooks. He detailed how victims were selected, how weapons were passed between members, and how logistics were managed behind the storefront facade of a legitimate local business. Yet, as Harris laid out the structure of the Death Angels, he dropped a detail that chilled the lead investigators to the core. The four men terrorizing San Francisco were not working alone, nor were their efforts confined to the city limits. Harris indicated that the network had operational cells extending into other parts of California, suggesting that the death toll already attributed to the zebra killers might be only a fraction of their actual body count. To prove his claims, Harris directed investigators to physical evidence that had eluded them for months. He recounted details of specific attacks with terrifying precision, including the brutal abduction and murder of Keita Haig, the execution of Jane Hawley in a public laundromat, and the shooting of future San Francisco Mayor Art Agnos, who had miraculously survived a bullet to the chest after attending a neighborhood meeting. Detectives moved quietly to corroborate Harris's statements against sealed evidence files. Item by item, his account matched facts that had never been disclosed to the press. Ballistics tests had already confirmed that a single .32 caliber Beretta automatic pistol had been used in multiple shootings across the city. Harris provided information that directly tied that specific weapon to the men operating out of the Black Self-Help Moving Company. The investigation had transformed overnight from a desperate search for a phantom killer into a high-stakes, clock-stopping operation to strike before the group realized Harris had turned. In the early morning hours of May 1, 1974, more than 80 heavily armed tactical officers launched simultaneous pre-dawn raids across San Francisco. Search warrants were executed at the Black Self-Help Moving Company and several residential apartments associated with the suspects. The operations were swift and carried out with surgical precision to prevent any warning from reaching the targets. Within hours, police took J.C. Simon, Larry Green, Manuel Moore, and Jesse Lee Cooks into custody. Inside the locations, officers seized a mountain of evidence, including firearms, ammunition, and notebooks that contained detailed lists of names, records, and photographs. The city let out a collective sigh of relief as Mayor Alioto held a triumphant press conference announcing that the zebra horror was finally over. Yet the widespread relief that swept across San Francisco in the spring of 1974 was almost immediately threatened by a ferocious legal storm. Even as police celebrated the massive evidentiary yield from the raids, defense attorneys were already assembling a challenge that threatened to dismantle the entire prosecution before it ever reached a jury. The controversy centered on Operation Zebra, the citywide police dragnet that had paralyzed San Francisco for weeks. Under the operation, tactical officers had stopped, questioned, and frisked more than 600 black men whose only crime was fitting an extremely broad physical description. Civil rights organizations and the American Civil Liberties Union filed an emergency federal lawsuit, arguing that the city was executing an unconstitutional police state policy based entirely on racial profiling. The legal pushback was immediate and fierce. Civil rights leaders pointed out that thousands of law-abiding black residents were being subjected to public humiliation, forced to carry special clearance cards issued by the police department just to walk to work or run errands without being detained. Federal District Judge Alfonso J. Zerpali heard the emergency arguments in late April. The city defended the dragnet as an unprecedented emergency measure required to stop an unprecedented wave of random bloodshed. But the federal judiciary drew a hard line. Judge Zerpali ruled that the police tactics violated the 4th and 14th Amendment rights of thousands of innocent citizens. The dragnet was declared unconstitutional, and the San Francisco Police Department was ordered to dismantle the special clearance card system immediately. Within hours, the street checks were halted, and the physical net was lifted from the city. Yet, the legal victory for civil rights left the homicide department back at square one. The profile of the killers was as broad as ever. Public panic was escalating to a breaking point, and investigators were now stripped of their primary method of visible deterrence. The city braced for another wave of midnight shootings, terrified that the court ruling had unwittingly given the killers free rein once again. But that wasn't the strangest part of where the investigation was heading. The break in the case didn't come from a midnight stop or a sophisticated forensic breakthrough. It came from a phone call from an insider who claimed to know the intimate details of a secret society operating in plain sight. On April 26, 1974, just days after Judge Zerpali's injunction, an informant named Anthony Harris reached out to the San Francisco Police Department. Harris was a 30-year-old former convict who was working at a local business called the Black Self-Help Moving Company on Market Street. He claimed he wasn't offering information out of civic duty, but out of absolute terror for his own life and a desire for the combined reward money, which had swelled to over $100,000 offered by the city and private donors. When investigators brought Harris to a secure location, he laid out a narrative so incredible that veteran detectives initially struggled to accept it as reality. Harris testified that the random string of murders was not the work of isolated lunatics or a chaotic street gang. It was, he claimed, the execution of an organized, methodical campaign carried out by a militant splinter faction within the Nation of Islam, who referred to themselves as the Death Angels. According to Harris, this group operated under a deeply twisted, apocalyptic dogma that rewarded the systematic murder of white citizens. To earn their wings, a spiritual promotion within the organization marked by physical death certificates or private badges, members were instructed to target non-black men, women, and children at random across the Bay Area. Points were allegedly assigned based on the age and gender of the victims, with higher status awarded for the murder of children or adult men who might put up a fight. Harris detailed secret meetings held in the basement of the Black Self-Help Moving Company, where potential targets were discussed and photograph albums of completed strikes were compiled as proof of execution. He named specific men within the company as the primary shooters and drivers, providing names, addresses, and weapon descriptions that matched details only key investigators knew. Yet as detectives listened to Harris, a massive contradiction surfaced that threatened to shatter his credibility before the investigation could even launch. Harris himself was a convicted felon with a lengthy record of armed robbery and fraud. He admitted to being present during several of the abductions and shootings, including the harrowing October 1973 kidnapping and decapitation of Keita Haig. Under intense interrogation, Harris claimed he had only acted as a driver or a passive bystander under intense coercion, fearing that if he refused to participate, he would become a victim himself. Prosecutors faced a high-stakes dilemma. To bring down the killer network, they would have to rely on the word of an admitted accomplice who had actively participated in the violent atmosphere of the group. If Harris was lying to secure the reward and save his own skin, the entire case would collapse under judicial scrutiny, destroying what was left of public trust in the police department. Despite the risk, the specific details Harris provided could not be ignored. He pointed detectives toward a piece of crucial physical evidence that no outsider could have known about: the precise disposition of a weapon used in multiple attacks. Acting on his disclosure, police recovered a .32 caliber Beretta semi-automatic pistol that had been discarded in an abandoned lot near a worksite tied to the suspects. Forensic ballistics testing was immediately ordered, working around the clock under absolute secrecy. Within 48 hours, the crime lab produced a definitive match. Striations on test-fired bullets from the recovered Beretta matched shell casings recovered from 4 separate Zebra crime scenes, including the murder of Jane Hawley in a laundromat and the severe wounding of future San Francisco Mayor Art Agnos, who had been shot in the chest and back after leaving a neighborhood meeting. The ballistic connection proved that Anthony Harris was telling the truth about the weapon, providing the probable cause necessary to dismantle the operation. Pre-dawn on May 1, 1974, over 100 heavily armed officers from the San Francisco Police Department, flanked by federal agents, launched coordinated raids across 7 locations in the city. The primary target was the Black Self-Help Moving Company on Market Street, along with several residential apartments tied to the core suspects. Within hours, police took 7 men into custody without a single shot being fired. The dragnet that had previously failed across the streets of San Francisco had finally succeeded through targeted intelligence. 4 men were ultimately indicted for the conspiracy and the murder spree: J.C.X. Simon, Larry Craig Green, Manuel Moore, and Jesse Lee Cooks. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community, with many residents expressing a mix of relief and skepticism. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the suspects were all connected to a radical black nationalist group, a fact that would later be cited as a potential motive for the killings. However, as detectives delved deeper into the case, they discovered that the lines between radical ideology and personal vendetta were blurred. The suspects' ties to the group were undeniable, but so were their individual grudges and petty squabbles, which seemed to have played a significant role in the murders. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the prosecution began to build its case, it emerged that one of the suspects, Jesse Lee Cooks, had been a police informant just months prior to the killings. This revelation raised serious questions about the reliability of the informant network and the potential for manipulation by those being informed upon. Had Cooks been using his position to feed misinformation to the police, or was he genuinely trying to cooperate? The answer to this question would have significant implications for the trial, and yet, it remained frustratingly out of reach. As the trial approached, the defense team launched a series of motions to suppress evidence, citing everything from coerced confessions to questionable search warrants. The prosecution, meanwhile, was keen to emphasize the strength of its case, pointing to eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence that seemingly linked the defendants to the crime scenes. However, a closer examination of the evidence revealed a number of inconsistencies and contradictions. For example, several eyewitnesses had identified different suspects at different crime scenes, while the forensic evidence, although compelling, was not without its limitations. The contradictions didn't stop there. As the trial got underway, it became clear that the defendants' stories didn't quite add up. Manuel Moore, for instance, claimed to have been at a friend's house at the time of one of the murders, but the friend in question had a questionable alibi of his own. Larry Craig Green, on the other hand, seemed to be shifting his story with each new iteration, leaving the prosecution to wonder what, if anything, he was hiding. And then, of course, there was J.C.X. Simon, who maintained his innocence throughout, despite being implicated by multiple witnesses. But what about the potential mastermind behind the killings? Some investigators believed that the true architect of the Zebra murders was still at large, pulling the strings from the shadows. This theory was supported by the fact that the killings had stopped abruptly after the arrests, suggesting that the perpetrators had been following a larger plan. However, as the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that the prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of a single key witness, a man named Anthony Harris. Harris's credibility was shaky at best, and his motives for cooperating with the authorities were far from clear. As the days turned into weeks, the trial continued to twist and turn, with each new revelation raising more questions than answers. The prosecution's case was built on a complex web of circumstantial evidence and eyewitness testimony, but the defense was quick to poke holes in the narrative. And yet, despite the inconsistencies and contradictions, the defendant's guilt seemed all but certain. Or did it? As the jury deliberated, a nagging sense of uncertainty lingered, fueled by the knowledge that the Zebra killers may have been motivated by something far more complex than a simple desire for revenge. The more one delves into the case, the more it becomes apparent that nothing is as straightforward as it seems. The Zebra killings were a product of their time, a toxic mix of racism, radical ideology, and social unrest. But they were also something more, a symptom of a deeper disease, one that continues to afflict American society to this day. As the verdict was finally delivered and the defendants were led away in handcuffs, the question on everyone's mind was, what happens next? Would justice be served, or would the true architects of the Zebra killings remain forever in the shadows, their motives and identities lost to the annals of history? The answer, much like the case itself, remains shrouded in uncertainty.